My meal plan for my wife to abandon me and our twins. Then she saw us triumph on TV. I thought my life was perfect, until I discovered the shocking truth. Everything I knew was a lie, and I was left wondering how I could ever recover. How did I end up here? And what could possibly come next? You won't believe how this story unfolds. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single second. When the door creaked open that evening, I knew my life was about to change forever. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden floor, and I could hear the faint gurgles of my twin daughters, Ella and Grace, from the nursery. My heart had been pounding ever since I saw Lily's packed suitcase sitting by the front door. The air in the house felt heavier, almost like the walls themselves knew what was happening. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breath, trying to keep it all together. I had been through a lot in my life, but nothing could have prepared me for this. When I turned around, there she was, Lily, standing in the middle of the living room, her expression unreadable. Her hands rested on the handle of that sleek, designer suitcase that I hadn't even known she'd bought. I noticed her perfectly pressed blouse, the new heels, and the subtle yet unmistakable change in her demeanor. She looked detached, removed from the world we'd built together. "Lily," I said, my voice catching in my throat. "What's going on?" She didn't answer at first, just looked at me with those cold eyes that had replaced the warmth I used to see. I took a step closer, trying to reach her, but she shifted her weight away from me, putting a few extra inches of space between us. That was when I saw it, the flicker of doubt, maybe even regret, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "You don't understand, Jake," she said, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "This life, it's not enough. I can't do this anymore." She glanced down at her suitcase, as if it held all the answers she couldn't say out loud. I felt a pang in my chest, an ache I couldn't ignore. My hands trembled as I raised them, palms open, almost pleading. "What do you mean, it's not enough? We have everything here, our home, our girls. Isn't that enough for you?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "My mom was right. I need more than this, more than what you can give me." Those words hit like a freight train. It wasn't just that she was leaving, it was the way she was leaving. She wasn't walking out on me because we fought too much, or because we'd grown apart. She was leaving because I wasn't enough. I could feel my heart shattering, piece by piece, and I had no idea how to stop it. My voice cracked as I tried to reason with her, to get her to see the life we had wasn't just some temporary thing, wasn't just something you walked away from because you felt like it. "Lily, please," I said, stepping closer. "Think about Ella and Grace. Think about what this will do to them. They need you. We need you." But she wouldn't look at me. Her gaze drifted toward the nursery door, where soft baby coos filled the heavy silence. For a moment, I thought she might turn back, might say something that would make all of this a bad dream. Instead, she squared her shoulders and tightened her grip on that damn suitcase. "I need stability, Jake. I need to think about my future. This isn't the life I want." Her voice was cold, detached, as if she'd rehearsed these lines over and over, as if she'd convinced herself that leaving her husband and her newborn daughters was just a logical decision. Nothing more. I could feel the anger rising inside me, mixing with the heartbreak. "So what? You're just going to walk out? Just like that? Abandon us because it's not what you want? What about what we need? What about the vows you made? Don't do this," she said quickly, her voice growing firmer. "I can't be the person you need me to be. I can't give them the life they deserve." She glanced toward the door again, as if she was afraid someone would burst in and stop her. I shook my head, the weight of her words crushing me. "They deserve a mother who's here for them," I said, my voice trembling. "They deserve a family, not a suitcase and an excuse." She flinched, her fingers tightening around the handle. "I've made my decision." The finality of it all hit me like a punch in the gut. I took one last look at her, hoping against hope that she would change her mind, that she'd realize what she was doing was insane, that she'd come back to us. But the sound of the car horn outside shattered any last bit of hope I had left. Her mother's driver was waiting, ready to whisk her away to whatever future she thought was better than the one we had. She reached for the door and paused, her back to me. "I'm sorry, Jake. I really am. But I can't stay." And then she was gone. The door closed softly, but it might as well have been a steel gate slamming shut. I stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been, my legs refusing to move. The sound of her heels clicking on the pavement, the engine starting, the car pulling away, it all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. But it wasn't, it was happening to me. I turned back to the nursery. Ella and Grace were still asleep, their tiny bodies snug in their cribs. They didn't know their mother had just walked out on them. They didn't know that our family had been torn apart. I walked to the crib and gently picked up Ella. Her little hands curled around my finger, her eyes opening for just a moment before closing again. My chest felt like it was about to cave in, but I held her close, whispering, "I'm here, baby girl. I'll always be here." That night, as I rocked Ella back to sleep and watched Grace's peaceful face, I made a promise to myself. I would do whatever it took to make sure they were okay. I would be enough for them, even if I had failed to be enough for Lily. I never thought I'd find myself standing in my kitchen at 2 a.m, staring at my phone and wondering if I had any chance at all of turning things around. It had been a few weeks since Lily left, and though the days had been long, the nights were infinitely worse. Ella and Grace were finally asleep, thank God for that, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. I leaned against the counter, the cold surface pressing against my arms, as I scrolled through my inbox, searching for any glimmer of hope. That's when I saw it. An email from a boutique owner who had stumbled across my little online store. The subject line read, "Potential partnership opportunity." My heart rate jumped. For a moment, I thought it might be a scam. One of those too good to be true offers from someone looking to take advantage of a desperate guy. But as I opened it and read through the lines, I realized this was real. A real boutique and actual, legitimate business was interested in carrying my products. I could hardly believe it. I stood there, rereading the email again and again, as if the words might suddenly change. They wanted me to send samples. They were impressed by my designs. They thought my products could do well in their store. All I had to do was deliver a small batch by the end of the week. Simple enough, right? Except it wasn't simple. Nothing was simple anymore. I set the phone down and rubbed my temples. My brain was already doing that thing it did when I was stressed, running every possible scenario through my head, over and over again. What if I couldn't deliver on time? What if the quality wasn't good enough? What if I made a mistake and lost the opportunity before it even started? I wasn't just gambling with a partnership. I was gambling with my kid's future. The thought made me sick. I couldn't fail again. Not after everything. I tried to tell myself it would be fine. I had done this before. I had filled orders, handled customer requests, shipped products. But this was different. This wasn't just some random Etsy shopper picking out a custom onesie for their baby shower. This was a professional client with real expectations. I wasn't sure I was up to the task. Still, I couldn't let this slip through my fingers. I replied to the email, agreeing to the timeline, and promising to send over the samples by Friday. As soon as I hit send, the weight of the decision sank in. I had 5 days to produce a high-quality batch of products that would meet the boutique standards. 5 days to prove that I could handle a larger-scale order. 5 days to get everything right. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. My daughters needed me to pull this off. They needed me to succeed, even if I wasn't sure how I'd manage it. The first day passed in a haze. Between feeding the twins, changing diapers, and dealing with their crying fits, I barely had time to think. Every spare moment was spent at my sewing machine or hunched over my laptop, trying to finalize the designs. The fabric I had on hand was good, but not great. I would need to place a rush order for better materials if I wanted these samples to stand out. That meant dipping into the last bit of savings I had left. The decision wasn't easy. I knew I was taking a risk, but what choice did I have? If I didn't invest in quality now, I might never get another chance. So I placed the order, paid the expedited shipping fee, and prayed that it would arrive in time. By the second day, exhaustion had fully set in. The twins were teething, which meant even less sleep than usual. I'd get them down for an hour or two, then one of them would start fussing, and the cycle would begin again. I felt like a zombie, running on caffeine and sheer willpower. The stress was taking a toll, and I could feel it in every muscle, every bone. But there was no time to rest. I kept working, measuring and cutting fabric, ironing out every wrinkle, double-checking every seam. The boutique owner had mentioned that their customers valued attention to detail. If I was going to impress them, I needed to deliver perfection. The pressure was immense. Every time I made a mistake, every crooked stitch, every misaligned print, I could feel the panic rising. What if I couldn't do this? What if I wasn't good enough? The doubts were relentless, and no matter how hard I tried to push them aside, they kept creeping back. On the third day, the new fabric arrived. It was beautiful, soft, durable, and exactly what I needed to make my products shine. For the first time since receiving that email, I felt a small surge of hope. Maybe this would work out after all. Maybe I could pull it off. I spent the entire day cutting and sewing, pouring every ounce of energy I had into those samples. By the time I collapsed into bed that night, I was too tired to even think. But at least I'd made progress. I could see the finish line, even if it still felt miles away. The fourth day brought more challenges. As I was packaging the first completed sample, I noticed a faint smudge on the fabric. My heart sank. I had worked so hard to keep everything clean and pristine, but somehow a bit of ink from my printer had transferred onto the material. I tried to wash it out, but it only made it worse. I had no choice but to start over. I felt the tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall. I couldn't break down now. I went back to the cutting table and began again, carefully replacing the stained panel with a fresh piece of fabric. Every move felt slower, heavier. I was running out of time, and I knew it. But I kept going, one step at a time. By the fifth day, I was running on empty. I had barely eaten, barely slept. My hands shook as I packed the final sample into the shipping box, checking it over one last time to make sure everything was perfect. The twins were napping in their cribs, and the house was eerily quiet. I looked around at the mess, the scraps of fabric on the floor, the empty coffee cups scattered across the counter, the piles of baby clothes waiting to be folded, and felt a wave of both relief and dread. I had done it. I had finished the samples. But what if they weren't good enough? What if the boutique owner opened that box, saw my work, and decided it wasn't worth her time? The thought made my stomach churn. I drove to the shipping center that afternoon, clutching the box like it contained the most valuable treasure in the world. As I handed it over to the clerk, I felt a mix of pride and terror. It was out of my hands now. All I could do was wait. The drive home was quiet. The radio played softly in the background, but I didn't really hear it. My mind was too busy running through all the what-ifs. What if the box got lost in transit? What if the fabric wrinkled during shipping? What if the colors didn't look as good under the boutique's lighting? By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was a wreck. But the girls were waiting for me inside, and I knew I had to pull it together. They were my reason for doing all of this. No matter how nervous I was, I couldn't let them see it. That night, I rocked Ella to sleep and watched Grace as she cooed softly in her crib. I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. I had done everything I could. I had given it my all. Whether the boutique chose to work with me or not, I knew I had pushed myself harder than I ever thought possible. I knew I had taken a step forward, even if I wasn't sure where that step would lead. And as I sat there in the dim light of the nursery, holding my sleeping daughter in my arms, I realized that no matter what happened next, I wouldn't regret trying. Could I really turn it all around? Would I find the strength to take back my life? What would you do in my shoes? Comment 1 if you think I'll succeed. 2 if you think I'm doomed to fail. Your predictions might just surprise you, so don't hold back. When I got the phone call that morning, I didn't know whether to feel relieved or panicked. The boutique owner had left a message saying the samples had arrived, and she was impressed. Impressed. She wanted to place an order. It was the news I had been hoping for since that first email. It should have been the break I needed, the moment when I could finally catch my breath. But instead, it felt like a weight had been added to my shoulders. The order was bigger than anything I'd done before. This wasn't just a handful of onesies for some online customers, this was a bulk order for a high-end boutique, and they expected it to be perfect. I hung up the phone and just stood there in my tiny living room, staring at the wall like an idiot. My brain was racing. How was I going to pull this off? Could I really handle it? I had been holding things together with duct tape and sheer willpower, and now they wanted me to scale up fast. I kept telling myself that this was a good problem to have. This was what I wanted, what I'd worked so hard for, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. The first step was to get more materials. My last batch had barely been enough for the samples, and I knew I couldn't use the same supplier. Their prices were too high, and their turnaround time was too slow. I spent the entire day online, calling around, chasing leads. Every supplier I talked to had a reason why they couldn't help. Too busy. Not enough stock. Too expensive. By the time I finally found one that could ship in time, and at a price I could afford, it was already late in the afternoon, and I was completely wiped out. The twins were crying hungry, tired, or just cranky. I didn't even know anymore, and I still had a mountain of work ahead of me. I fed them, changed their diapers, and put them down for a nap, all while mentally running through my to-do list. My hands were shaking as I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and placed the order for the fabric. It felt like I was gambling with money I didn't have. The boutique's payment wouldn't come in until I delivered the goods, which meant I was dipping into my already dwindling savings. My stomach churned at the thought of what would happen if something went wrong, but I couldn't let that stop me. I had to move forward. For the girls. For us. Once the fabric arrived, the real work began. My apartment turned into a makeshift factory. The dining table disappeared under piles of material, patterns, and sewing supplies. Every spare inch of counter space was covered in thread spools and scissors. The air smelled like fresh fabric and coffee, so much coffee. I put on some music to help me focus, but it didn't do much to drown out the sound of my own thoughts. Every stitch felt like a test. Every completed onesie like a tiny victory. But as the days wore on, the pressure started to build. I made mistakes. Small ones at first, crooked seams, missed threads. Then bigger ones, cutting too much fabric, ruining entire pieces. Each error felt like a punch to the gut. The clock was ticking, and I couldn't afford to lose any more time or materials. The boutique's deadline loomed over me. A constant reminder that failure wasn't an option. It didn't help that the twins were teething again. They cried more, slept less, and needed even more of my attention. I was running on fumes, grabbing a few minutes of rest whenever they napped, which wasn't often. I'd find myself dozing off at the sewing machine, only to jolt awake when Grace started fussing in the crib. I'd rub my eyes, take another swig of coffee, and get back to work. The days blurred together. Feed the girls. Sew. Change diapers. Sew. Try to sleep. Sew. It was a relentless cycle, and I could feel myself unraveling. But every time I thought about giving up, I'd picture Ella's tiny fingers curled around mine, or Grace's sleepy smile when I rocked her to sleep. That was enough to keep me going. Just when I thought I was making progress, disaster struck. I was almost done with the first batch when I noticed something was off. The colors looked wrong. Not drastically wrong, but just enough that they didn't match the samples. My heart sank. I grabbed the fabric scraps and compared them to the original pieces. Sure enough, the dye lot was slightly different. It wasn't my fault. The supplier must have sent me fabric from a different batch, but that didn't matter. The boutique owner had loved the original colors, and now I was about to deliver something that didn't look the same. My first instinct was to call and explain the situation, but I knew that wouldn't go over well. They'd see it as an excuse, a reason to doubt my professionalism. No, I had to fix it. Somehow. I spent hours trying different combinations, mixing pieces from the new fabric with what little I had left from the original batch. I had to make it work. I didn't have the time or the money to reorder materials and start over. By the time I finished, I was physically and emotionally drained. My hands were blistered from the scissors. My back ached from hours hunched over the machine. And my head was pounding from lack of sleep. But the onesies were done. I packed them carefully, checking each one multiple times to make sure the stitching was perfect, and the colors were as close as possible. As I sealed the final box, a wave of relief washed over me. I had done it. Somehow, against all odds, I had completed the order. But the relief was short-lived. The doubts crept back, and almost immediately. What if the boutique noticed the color difference? What if they rejected the order? What if this was all for nothing? I tried to push those thoughts away as I loaded the boxes into my car, but they clung to me like a shadow. Driving to the boutique's warehouse felt like heading to the gallows. The entire ride, I kept running through scenarios in my head. Maybe they wouldn't notice. Maybe they'd love the design so much they'd overlook the slight color change. Or maybe they'd see the difference right away and decide I wasn't worth the risk. By the time I arrived, My palms were slick with sweat, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the warehouse entrance, trying to summon the courage to go in. It felt like everything was riding on this delivery. If they accepted the order, it could open doors to more opportunities, more stability. If they rejected it, I didn't even want to think about that. I took a deep breath, wiped my hands on my jeans, and got out of the car. The boxes weren't heavy, but carrying them inside felt like carrying the weight of the world. I handed them off to the warehouse manager, who gave me a polite nod and said they'd be inspected before payment was issued. And just like that, it was out of my hands. I walked back to my car feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. I had done my part. Now all I could do was wait. I stared at the email on my screen, rereading the words until they blurred together. Complaints? Returns? My heart sank. This wasn't supposed to happen. I had worked tirelessly to make sure every single item was perfect, yet here I was, facing the exact scenario I had feared from the beginning. The boutique owner's message was straightforward but cut like a knife. A handful of customers had reported issues with the products. The colors faded too quickly. The seams didn't hold up after a few washes. They weren't happy, and now the boutique wasn't happy. I leaned back in my chair, the creak of the wood under me echoing in the silence. The room was dim, the blinds drawn to keep the early morning sun from waking the twins. It had only been a few days since I delivered the order, and already things were unraveling. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Had I missed something during quality checks? Had the fabric been defective from the start? My hands clenched into fists as a wave of self-doubt washed over me. I had thought I was past this, that I was ready to handle the big leagues, but now it felt like I was back at square one, scrambling to prove I wasn't a fraud. I couldn't afford to lose this partnership. Not now. The boutique had been my ticket to stability, a lifeline I had clung to after everything fell apart. If they pulled out, I didn't know how I'd keep going. The girls were already down to one can of formula, and rent was due at the end of the month. My stomach twisted at the thought of what would happen if I couldn't make it work. I had to fix this. I had to. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the boutique owner's number, each ring tightening the knot in my chest. When she answered, her tone was neutral professional, but I could tell she was frustrated. I could hear the faint clatter of hangers in the background, the bustle of her store opening for the day. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Jake, we've got a problem," she said. "Customers are returning items. They're saying the quality isn't what they expected. We need to address this now." I gripped the phone tighter. "I understand," I said quickly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll take care of it. I'll make it right." She paused. "You need to figure out what went wrong. This is your first order with us, and if we can't rely on you, you can," I interrupted, my throat tightening. "You can rely on me, I'll fix it." She sighed. "Okay. I'm holding you to that. I need a solution by the end of the week." The line clicked, and she was gone. I set the phone down on the table and stared at it, as if willing it to ring again and tell me everything was fine. But that wasn't going to happen. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around me. I knew I needed to move fast. First, I pulled the remaining pieces of fabric I had left, comparing them to the returns I had gotten back. The complaints were consistent fading colors, weak seams. I couldn't argue with them. I could see it with my own eyes. The fabric wasn't holding up the way it should. But why? It had passed all the initial tests. I rubbed my temples, trying to focus. Maybe it wasn't just the fabric. Maybe it was something in the production process. Something I overlooked in my rush to meet the deadline. I had been so desperate to get everything out on time that I hadn't double-checked every piece. That was a mistake I couldn't afford to make again. I needed answers, and fast. I made a list of every step I'd taken, from cutting the fabric to stitching the last seam. As I went through each point, it became clear that the rush order from the new supplier had cut corners. The fabric quality wasn't consistent. Some pieces were fine, but others showed signs of wear before they even reached the boutique. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for another supplier, someone more reliable, someone who could deliver high-quality material without breaking the bank. The clock was ticking, and I needed a fix before this turned into a disaster I couldn't recover from. The twins stirred in their cribs, their soft cries pulling me from my thoughts. I closed the laptop and crossed the room, scooping up Ella first, then Grace. Their tiny hands grabbed at my shirt as I held them close, rocking them gently. "It's okay," I whispered, more to myself than to them. "I'll fix it. I'll figure it out." But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I could. I was tired, exhausted, and the weight of it all felt like too much. I sank into the rocking chair, holding both girls against my chest, and stared at the wall. I didn't have time to feel sorry for myself. I had to keep moving, keep working. I set them back in their cribs once they drifted off and returned to the table. The light from the laptop screen lit up the room as I typed out emails, made calls, and took notes. The hours slipped by, the morning sun rising higher in the sky. By noon, I had a lead on a new supplier who promised higher quality fabric and a quicker turnaround. It would cost more, but at this point, I didn't care. I placed the order and immediately got to work on a new set of samples, determined to get them to the boutique before the end of the week. As the days passed, I threw myself into the work. Every spare moment was spent sewing, checking, and rechecking each piece. I refused to let a single flaw slip through. The pressure was immense, and the clock seemed to move faster than ever. By the time Friday came around, I had a fresh batch ready to go. I packed them up carefully, double-checked the packaging, and delivered them to the boutique myself. The owner was polite, but distant. I could tell she was waiting to see if I could deliver on my promise. I left the store feeling both relieved and anxious. I had done my part, now I just had to hope it was enough. The drive home was quiet. The twins were asleep, and the radio played softly in the background. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. I didn't know what the boutique's response would be, but at least I had taken a step in the right direction. I had made a mistake, but I had also taken responsibility and worked to fix it. As I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I looked at the house. It wasn't much, but it was home. The girls were my world, and no matter how many challenges came my way, I knew I couldn't give up. I wasn't just fighting for a business, I was fighting for them, and I wasn't going to let them down. By the time the boutique owner called me to say the new samples were finally up to her standards, I thought I'd feel a sense of relief. Instead, it felt like I'd just been handed another ticking clock. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as she confirmed that the latest batch would work. "I'll need a full shipment within 2 weeks," she said, and before I could respond, she added, "Make sure the quality stays consistent. We can't afford any more issues." The call ended with a polite but firm click, leaving me staring at my phone, realizing just how much weight those few words carried. 2 weeks. A full order. Perfect quality. I put the phone down and tried to steady my breath. This was my chance to redeem myself, to prove I could handle it. But the pressure to get it right, to deliver something flawless this time, was crushing. I looked around my apartment, the cluttered workspace that doubled as a living room, and the nursery down the hall, and wondered how I'd manage. The twins were teething again, their cries cutting through the night like a constant reminder of how little sleep I was running on. I rubbed my temples, and told myself I'd figure it out. I had to. The first step was getting more materials. I couldn't rely on the supplier who had let me down before, so I spent the next several hours researching alternatives, calling manufacturers, and running calculations. It wasn't just about finding fabric that matched the quality I needed. It was about finding it fast and at a price I could afford. Each phone call seemed to take forever, and every email I sent felt like it vanished into the void. My frustration grew as the hours dragged on. Just when I was ready to throw my hands up, I finally got a lead. A small supplier based out of North Carolina had the fabric I needed, and promised it could be shipped within 3 days. The catch? It was going to cost me more than I'd planned. I stared at the number on my screen, knowing that dipping into what little savings I had left was risky. But I didn't see another option. I placed the order, and leaned back in my chair, feeling the knot in my chest tighten. There was no turning back now. I had to make this work. The fabric arrived right on time, but getting it was only half the battle. With the twins fussier than ever, it felt like I was constantly bouncing between sewing and soothing them. I'd settle Ella down, only for Grace to start wailing. By the time I got them both to sleep, I was too wired to rest. Instead, I stayed up stitching until my hands ached and my vision blurred. I had hoped that once I started working with the new fabric, the process would go more smoothly. But the truth was that the pressure made every decision feel heavier. Every cut, every seam, every fold, if I screwed up even once, I'd lose valuable time and material. The boutique owner's words rang in my head. We can't afford any more issues. I couldn't afford them either. The stakes were too high. Rent was due in less than a week, and I was down to my last can of baby formula. Failure wasn't an option. Not when the girls were depending on me to hold it together. As I worked late into the night, I started to feel the walls closing in. The apartment, once a place of comfort, had become a workshop, a storage unit, a maze of fabric scraps and shipping boxes. I had moved my sewing machine into the living room, clearing out what little space I had left, just to give myself more room to maneuver. My back was sore from sitting hunched over the table for hours on end, and my shoulders felt like they were made of lead. The constant hum of the machine, once a soothing reminder that I was making progress, now felt like a relentless drone in my ears. I tried to focus on the bigger picture, on the promise I'd made to myself and to the girls. This order wasn't just about keeping a client happy. It was about building something stable, something that would allow me to provide for my family. I held onto that thought like a lifeline, repeating it over and over whenever the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. This is for them, I'd whisper under my breath. This is for Ella and Grace. On the fourth night, just as I was finally starting to see real progress, a new problem emerged. The dye on one section of fabric seemed slightly off, just enough that it was noticeable under the harsh light of my desk lamp. My heart sank as I ran my fingers over the material, hoping it was a trick of the light. But no. It was there, a subtle difference in shade that threw off the entire batch. I wanted to scream. After all the work I'd put in, after everything I'd done to ensure perfection, this felt like a cruel joke. I paced the room, trying to figure out how to salvage it. The idea of starting over was unthinkable. I didn't have the time or resources to reorder materials and redo the work. Instead, I pulled out a smaller cutting mat and started experimenting. Maybe I could mix and match pieces, blend the shades in a way that looked intentional. Maybe, just maybe, I could turn a flaw into a feature. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option I had. I worked until the sun began to rise. And when I finally stepped back to look at the finished products, I could only hope the boutique would see them the same way I did. Not perfect, but close enough. When the delivery day arrived, I packed up the order with shaking hands. The twins were mercifully calm for once, their soft coos filling the silence as I placed the boxes in the car. The drive to the boutique felt endless, each red light stretching on for an eternity. My mind was a whirlwind of what-ifs. What if they noticed the slight difference in dye? What if they refused the order? What if this was the end of the road for my business? By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my palms were slick with sweat. I took a deep breath, grabbed the boxes, and walked through the boutique's doors. The owner greeted me with a polite but guarded smile. I set the boxes down on the counter and waited as she inspected them. Every second felt like an hour. She lifted one of the pieces, running her fingers over the fabric, her expression unreadable. "It's an improvement," she said finally, her voice even. "We'll move forward with this." I nodded, trying not to let the relief show on my face. "Thank you," I managed, my voice steady. "I'll make sure the next batch is even better." She gave me a curt nod and turned her attention to a clipboard on the counter. I left the boutique feeling drained, but slightly more hopeful. This wasn't the triumph I had imagined, but it wasn't a failure either. I had managed to keep the partnership alive, and for now, that was enough. As I drove back home, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the twins, their tiny faces peaceful in their car seats. I knew I'd have to keep fighting, keep pushing, keep improving. They deserved nothing less. As I stood in the dimly lit workshop that I'd carved out of my living room, I couldn't shake the nagging fear that this next order might be the one that broke me. I had managed to smooth things over with the boutique, for now. But it had cost me every ounce of energy and more sleepless nights than I could count. With the twins finally asleep in the next room, I stared at the stacks of fabric and sewing supplies on the table, wondering how I could keep up the pace. My body was worn out, my hands ached, and my mind was constantly racing with what felt like a million worries. Rent was due in a few days, I was running low on supplies, and I still didn't know if the boutique would stick with me long term. Yet somehow, I knew I had no choice but to press on. Failure wasn't just about losing a client. It was about letting down my daughters, the two tiny, innocent lives that depended on me to keep this ship afloat. That thought alone kept me going, even as the stress piled on like bricks on my shoulders. I ran my hands over the fabric, checking for flaws I couldn't afford to let slip through. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. Even the smallest defect could set off another cascade of returns, another series of tense phone calls with the boutique owner, another battle to prove I was worth their investment. I couldn't let that happen again. So I measured, cut, and sewed with a precision I didn't know I was capable of. Each stitch felt like a test of my resolve. Each finished piece a tiny victory that pushed me closer to meeting the deadline. I knew I was walking a tightrope, and one misstep would send me plummeting. The pressure was constant, unrelenting. I'd always thought running my own business would give me freedom. But instead, it felt like I was locked in a never-ending race against time, money, and my own limits. As the hours ticked by, I found myself thinking back to why I started this in the first place. It had been out of necessity, just a way to keep the lights on, after everything fell apart. But somewhere along the line, it had become more than that. It had become a fight for stability, for dignity, for something that felt like a future. I thought about Ella and Grace, about the nights I'd rock them to sleep with tears in my eyes, wondering if I'd be able to keep this up. They didn't know how hard things were, and I wanted to keep it that way. I wanted them to grow up proud of their dad, not burdened by the weight of his failures. That's what drove me to keep going, to keep pushing through the exhaustion, the doubt, and the constant setbacks. By the time the first batch of the new order was done, it was well past midnight. The only sound in the room was the soft whir of the sewing machine, and the occasional creak of the floorboards as I moved between stations. I stacked the finished pieces neatly on the table, triple checking each one for quality. The boutique had made it clear, no more mistakes. If anything was off, I'd lose the account. My hands trembled as I inspected the last piece, feeling the weight of the deadline pressing down on me like a vice. Everything looked good, but I couldn't shake the fear that I'd missed something. The doubts crept in, whispering that I wasn't cut out for this, that I was in over my head. But I pushed them aside, because I didn't have the luxury of doubt. The twins stirred in their cribs, and I quickly tiptoed over to calm them down. Their tiny faces were so peaceful, so full of trust, and that trust gave me strength. I couldn't let them down. The following morning, I packed the finished pieces into boxes, and loaded them into the car. The sky was overcast, casting a dull, gray light over the city as I drove to the boutique's warehouse. My heart pounded the entire way, each bump in the road sending a jolt of nerves through me. I rehearsed what I'd say if the boutique owner wasn't happy, how I'd convince her to give me one more chance if something went wrong. But deep down, I knew there wasn't room for another mistake. I had to get it right this time. When I arrived, I unloaded the boxes and carried them inside. The warehouse manager gave me a polite nod as he signed off on the delivery, but I could tell he was watching closely, ready to report any issues. I stood there as he inspected the first few pieces, holding my breath as if that would somehow influence his judgment. Finally, he looked up and gave a curt nod. "Looks good," he said. "I'll let her know." I exhaled slowly, trying to contain the wave of relief that threatened to knock me over. But the moment was short-lived. I knew this was just one hurdle. The boutique had accepted the order, but I couldn't rest easy. There were more orders to fill, more deadlines to meet, and no guarantee that I'd be able to keep up. As I drove home, the reality of my situation settled in. I was grateful that this round had gone smoothly, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was always one step away from disaster. I needed a long-term solution, something that would give me stability rather than just surviving from one order to the next. The question was, how? Back at the apartment, the twins greeted me with their usual giggles and outstretched arms, unaware of the storm raging inside me. Their laughter was a reminder of why I was doing all of this, why I couldn't give up no matter how overwhelming it felt. I held them close, their tiny hands gripping my shirt, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was still here. I was still fighting. And as long as I had them to fight for, I knew I couldn't let the fear win. I'd find a way, no matter how hard it got. I had to. For them, and for the future I was trying so hard to build. I'll never forget the moment I realized I was out of options. The boutique had come back to me with yet another adjustment, another tweak to the order, and I knew in my gut I didn't have the time, the resources, or the energy to make it happen. My hands were sore from the endless hours at the sewing machine. My eyes burned from nights spent squinting at patterns under the weak overhead light in the living room, and my body felt like it could give out any second. But it wasn't just the physical toll. It was the weight of knowing I had nothing left to give. No savings to dip into. No cushion to soften the blow. The twins, asleep in their cribs, had no idea just how close I was to losing everything. They looked so peaceful, so completely untouched by the storm that was closing in. I stood in the doorway of their room, staring at them, and wondering how much longer I could keep pretending that I had this under control. The email from the boutique's buyer was still fresh in my mind. She was polite but firm, professional enough that it stung more. The adjustments needed to be made. They had specific feedback from customers. And if I couldn't implement the changes, they'd have to look elsewhere. My chest felt heavy as I imagined what that would mean. No more orders, no more income. I'd lose the only real client I had managed to secure. The thought made my stomach churn. I walked back into the kitchen and sat at the cluttered table, surrounded by scraps of fabric, order forms, and an empty coffee cup that hadn't been washed in days. The place looked as chaotic as I felt. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my emails again, reading the buyer's words one more time, hoping I'd missed something. But it was clear. If I couldn't meet their expectations, they wouldn't hesitate to end the partnership. I stared at the screen until the words blurred together, then put the phone down and buried my face in my hands. I didn't have any more favors to call in. No friends I could borrow money from. No family members who could bail me out. It was just me, and two babies who depended on me for everything. As I sat there, the silence was deafening. My mind raced, trying to find a way out. Could I turn the order around faster if I skipped sleeping entirely? Could I sell anything to raise a bit more cash? My old laptop wasn't worth much, and the furniture was so beat up. I doubted anyone would buy it. But even if I managed to scrape together enough money for materials, I still didn't know how I'd meet the boutique's new requirements. I needed help, but hiring someone was out of the question. The numbers just didn't add up. Every scenario I ran through in my head ended the same way. I was screwed. The pressure was unbearable. I knew I couldn't break down. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. The twins needed me, and every time I looked at them, I was reminded of why I was pushing so hard. But I was barely holding it together. My hands were shaking as I reached for my notepad, trying to come up with a plan. I started writing down ideas, anything that came to mind. Maybe I could streamline the designs. Maybe I could find a local supplier with lower shipping costs. Maybe, just maybe, I could negotiate for more time. But even as I scribbled down those possibilities, a voice in my head kept whispering, "You're out of time, you're out of money, you're out of chances." I sat there for what felt like hours, my thoughts spinning, my pulse racing. The twins stirred in their cribs, and I got up to check on them, glad for the brief distraction. Ella was still sound asleep, but Grace's tiny fists were clenched. Her face scrunched in that pre-cry expression that always made my heart race. I picked her up and rocked her gently, humming a song I couldn't even remember the words to. Her cries faded, and she nestled into my shoulder, her breath warm against my neck. For a moment, the weight on my chest lifted. I held her close, her small body so fragile, yet somehow the strongest thing in my life. She was the reason I couldn't give up, the reason I had to keep fighting. As I put her back down, I felt a pang of guilt. I had been so focused on keeping the business afloat that I barely had time to just be their dad. Every moment I spent trying to salvage my work was a moment I wasn't spending with them. I knew they deserved better, but I also knew I didn't have a choice. If I couldn't make this work, we'd have nothing. I went back to the kitchen and stared at the piles of fabric on the table. I had to make a decision. I could spend the next few days killing myself to meet the boutique's new demands, or I could walk away from it all. The thought of quitting made me sick to my stomach, but the idea of continuing to spin my wheels only to fail again was just as unbearable. I took a deep breath and reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I scrolled to the buyer's contact information. My thumb hovered over the call button. What was I going to say? That I needed more time? More money? More something? In the end, I couldn't bring myself to call her. Instead, I put the phone down and turned back to the table. I needed to see if there was anything at all that I could do differently. Maybe if I focused on just one design, simplified the process, I could meet their demands. I grabbed a piece of fabric and started cutting, letting the rhythm of the work calm me. The sound of scissors slicing through the cloth, the steady hum of the sewing machine, these were the only things that kept me grounded. By the time the sun came up, I had a small stack of prototypes ready. I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile thread that I clung to as I packed them up and wrote a quick email to the boutique. I explained that I'd made the changes they requested, that the new designs were ready for their approval. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, my body aching from another night without sleep. Now, all I could do was wait and hope that this time, it would be enough. The email sat there in my inbox, the preview line taunting me with its brevity. Please confirm changes to the order by EOD. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, the cursor blinking in the subject line, as though waiting for me to make a move. After a few moments of hesitation, I opened it and read the full message. The boutique needed a firm answer on the revised order, no exceptions, and they wanted it by the end of the day. No more extensions, no more apologies. Either I could meet their specifications, or I couldn't. It felt like a deadline looming over my entire existence. I shifted my weight in the chair, the wood creaking under me as I rubbed my temples. The kitchen table had become my makeshift office, cluttered with fabric swatches, scraps of paper, and a notepad filled with frantic calculations. I was painfully aware of the ticking clock. Ella and Grace would wake up soon, and once they did, all bets were off. This was my only window to figure out a plan, but my brain felt like it was stuck in molasses, sluggish and uncooperative. The boutique wanted perfection. They wanted something I wasn't sure I could deliver. Not on this timeline, not with the resources I had. And yet, I knew I had to try. There was no safety net, no backup plan. It was me against the clock, and I couldn't afford to lose. Taking a deep breath, I started jotting down ideas, trying to find a way to streamline the process. Could I eliminate one of the design elements to save time? Could I source a different fabric that would arrive faster, even if it cost more? Every option felt like a gamble, and I hated that feeling. I'd never been much of a risk taker before all of this. I'd always played it safe, taken the steady job, the predictable path. But ever since Lily had left, and I found myself with 2 tiny babies, and no steady income, safe had disappeared from my vocabulary. Now, every choice felt like a leap into the unknown. I glanced at my phone, checking the time. It was already mid-morning. I'd spent too much time deliberating. I needed to make a decision, but every time I tried to commit, doubt crept in. What if the boutique rejected the changes? What if they decided I wasn't worth the hassle and cut ties altogether? I felt like I was walking a tightrope, and every step forward only made it more likely I'd lose my balance. The twins stirred in their cribs, and I knew my time was up. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor, and headed down the hall to their room. Grace was already awake, her tiny hands reaching out as she made those soft, insistent noises that let me know she wouldn't be quiet for long. I picked her up and cradled her against my chest, her head resting on my shoulder. Ella was still asleep, but I knew it wouldn't last. I carried Grace back into the kitchen, bouncing her gently as I tried to think, how could I make this work? How could I keep the boutique happy, and still maintain my sanity? I sat down at the table with Grace on my lap, her little fingers grabbing at my shirt. She had no idea how much I needed this to work, how much was riding on this one order. To her, I was just Dad, the guy who held her when she cried, and fed her mashed bananas, and made funny faces to make her giggle. She didn't know about the deadlines or the stress or the sleepless nights. She didn't care about profit margins or production costs. All she wanted was love and security, and I was determined to give her that. I just didn't know how I was going to pull it off. Eventually, Ella woke up, and the rest of the morning passed in a blur of bottles, diaper changes, and trying to keep them entertained. By the time they both went down for their afternoon nap, I was back at the table, staring at the email again. I needed to reply. I needed to confirm that I could meet their demands. But every time I moved my hands toward the keyboard, my mind froze. I felt like I was trapped in quicksand, every decision pulling me deeper into a pit of anxiety. Finally, I forced myself to start typing. I kept the reply short, professional, and to the point. I confirmed the changes, assured them I could deliver, and hit send before I could second guess myself. The moment I clicked that button, a wave of dread washed over me. What if I'd made the wrong call? What if I couldn't pull it off? But there was no turning back now. The countdown had begun, and I had to make good on my promise. I spent the rest of the day working on the revised designs, ignoring the ache in my back and the tightness in my chest. When the twins woke up, I took breaks to feed them and change them, but as soon as they were settled, I went right back to work. The dining table was covered in fabric, thread, and a half-empty cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The air was filled with the hum of the sewing machine, and the occasional soft coo from the twins in their bouncy seats nearby. I'd managed to move their seats into the kitchen so I could keep an eye on them while I worked. They didn't seem to mind, and every time they giggled or waved their tiny hands, it reminded me why I was pushing myself so hard. As the sun set, the room took on a dim, golden hue, the light filtering through the window blinds. The twins had fallen asleep again, and I was alone with my thoughts. I looked at the half-finished designs in front of me and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could pull this off. Maybe the changes would be enough, and the boutique would be satisfied. I knew I still had a mountain to climb, but for the first time that day, I felt like I was finally moving forward. I picked up my scissors and got back to work, one careful cut at a time. By the time the sun began to rise the next morning, I was still at the kitchen table, staring at the last box of finished products, and feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. I hadn't slept a minute, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was catching my breath. The boutique's latest requirements had been met, at least as far as I could tell. The fabric was flawless, the designs crisp, and the stitching more precise than it had ever been. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was close enough that I could stand by it. Now all that was left was to deliver the shipment and hope it was good enough. As I packed the boxes into the back of my car, the morning air felt sharp against my skin. The sky was a pale blue, the streets still quiet, and for a moment, I let myself enjoy the calm. The twins were still asleep, their little bodies curled up peacefully in their cribs, and I knew I'd have just enough time to make the delivery and get back before they woke up. It was a delicate balance, trying to juggle the demands of a growing business and 2 newborns. But I had learned to make it work. Or, at least, I was still trying to figure it out. Each day felt like a new test, and each test a reminder of how far I'd come, and how much further I had to go. The drive to the boutique felt longer than usual, even though I knew it wasn't. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white against the faded leather. I replayed the boutique's last email in my head, searching for any hint of doubt or dissatisfaction. But there was nothing to do now but follow through. I had spent the past week reworking the order, tweaking the designs, and double-checking every last detail. I had done everything I could, and now it was out of my hands. Still, the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. When I arrived at the boutique's warehouse, the manager greeted me with a neutral expression. Clipboard in hand, I unloaded the boxes, careful not to show how badly my hands were shaking from fatigue. The manager scanned the packing list, then opened one of the boxes to inspect the contents. I held my breath, watching as he examined a few pieces, his face giving nothing away. My chest tightened as the seconds dragged on. Finally, he looked up and nodded. "Looks good," he said, jotting something down on the clipboard. "We'll let you know if we need anything else." I nodded back, keeping my voice steady as I said, "Great. Thank you." But inside, I felt like I'd just run a marathon. As I climbed back into the car, I let out a long breath. The boutique hadn't rejected the order. That was one small victory, but it still didn't feel like enough. I had no idea if this would lead to more work, more orders, or if it was just delaying the inevitable. The uncertainty was suffocating. But for now, all I could do was keep moving forward. Back home, the twins were awake and babbling in their cribs. Their small voices filled the room, and I couldn't help but smile despite my exhaustion. I scooped them up, one in each arm, and carried them into the living room. They laughed and grabbed at my shirt, their tiny fingers pulling at the fabric. In that moment, the stress of the boutique and the business melted away, replaced by the simple joy of being with them. They didn't care about deadlines or profit margins. To them, I was just dad their whole world. And that reminder was enough to keep me going, no matter how hard things got. As the day wore on, I tried to focus on the next steps. There was always something else to do. New designs to draft, suppliers to call, orders to fulfill. I knew I couldn't afford to lose momentum. The boutique's order had been a hurdle, but it wasn't the finish line. If I wanted this business to survive, I had to keep pushing, keep improving. That meant making the operation more efficient, finding ways to cut costs without sacrificing quality, and figuring out how to balance it all with being a single parent. It wasn't easy, but every time I looked at the twins, I knew I couldn't give up. They depended on me, and I was determined to give them a life they could be proud of. A few days later, I received an email from the boutique's buyer. My heart raced as I opened it, my hands trembling slightly. The message was short and to the point. They were pleased with the recent order and wanted to discuss a potential follow-up. I read it twice, then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. They wanted more. It was a small step, but it felt like a major breakthrough. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe this could actually work. Maybe I could turn this business into something sustainable, something real. But even as that hope took hold, I knew better than to get too comfortable. I had learned the hard way that success was never guaranteed. Every order, every client, every decision was a gamble. The pressure never truly went away, it just changed form. And yet, in spite of all that, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just scrambling to stay afloat anymore. I was building something. I was creating a future for my daughters, one stitch at a time. I spent the next several weeks refining my process, streamlining production, and working on new designs. The late nights and early mornings continued, but they felt different now. The weight of uncertainty was still there, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I had made it this far. I had faced setbacks, doubts, and sleepless nights, and I was still standing. That realization gave me a quiet confidence, a reminder that I was stronger than I had given myself credit for. As the months went on, the business slowly began to stabilize. Orders became more consistent. The boutique placed regular requests, and I started to gain a small but loyal customer base. It wasn't the overnight success story I had once dreamed of, but it was real. It was steady. And most importantly, it allowed me to provide for my daughters. I was still exhausted most days, and the challenges never stopped coming. But I had found a rhythm, a fragile balance that allowed me to keep moving forward. There were moments, sitting at that same kitchen table late at night, when I thought about how far I'd come. I thought about the sleepless nights, the times I wanted to throw in the towel, and the moments when it all seemed impossible. But I also thought about Ella and Grace, their laughter, their milestones, and the life I was building for them. Those moments made every struggle worthwhile. They reminded me why I had started this journey in the first place, and why I would keep going, no matter what. I wasn't just making products or filling orders. I was creating a legacy for my family. And that, more than anything else, was what kept me going. And that's how I turned my nightmare into a story of triumph. But the journey's far from over. What happens next will leave you speechless. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment. What would you do if you were in my shoes? I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Life struggles can break you down, but they can also build you up. I learned that perseverance, even when you feel alone and overwhelmed, can yield incredible results. You don't have to be perfect, you just need to keep going. Take ownership of your choices, adapt when challenges come, and remember that even small steps lead to great change. In the end, what matters isn't where you start but how you finish. We all have the power to improve our lives and help others by showing resilience and determination, qualities that can make our nation stronger and more united.